Welcome to this TSO webinar where we'll be discussing how user feedback can help to drive innovation in digital products and services and improve customer experience. My name is Lisa Hallett and I'm Marketing Director for TSO, the leading regulatory publisher. And I'm here with Dr. Mulgrew, TSO's Head of Design and Research. Now, we're both passionate about user focus, me from a marketing perspective, as marketing is all about delivering what customers want, and Den from a service design and systems thinking perspective. So to start with, Den, can you tell us a little bit about your role and your experience?
Yeah, I can. Thank you, Lisa. So my name is Dan. I am the head of design and research at TSO. So my team and I work across our full portfolio of public sector clients. And my background's a little bit circuitous into service design. So I started off with my master's in business improvement, and I was working in the healthcare sector, so in the secondary care space. And I got really interested in the quality improvement methodology. So I very luckily got onto the Quality Improvement Fellowship at the Southeastern Health and Social Care Trust. And that was all about using the IHI, so the Institute for Healthcare Improvement methodology for improving patient outcomes, and that real core focus on co-production and user feedback. And so from there, obviously, there's a lot of overlap between that quality improvement and service design, those methodologies, those spaces. And I moved into service design in the private sector. So I worked as a consultant largely in the omni-channel retail space, but with a core focus on e-commerce, so those digital products within that space. And then I moved to you lovely people at TSO, where again, moving back into that public sector space as well.
Great, thanks, Den. So the title of our webinar today is How Negative Feedback Can Help You to Innovate. People can be scared by negative feedback though, can't they? So what's your perspective on that?
So we've talked about this a lot, but negative feedback is an opportunity. It's not a threat to us. And I think it's really normal for teams to fear negative feedback because it can feel like criticism or it can feel like failure. And certainly when you're presenting to leadership boards, you don't want a low CSAT. But in reality, we call it negative feedback, but it's not negative feedback. It's just information. And I think we can, make it a little bit less scary when we think about it in that way. And it's really, at the end of the day, one of our most valuable sources of insight because it tells you exactly where your pain points are and what's not working for your users. And everything we do is to produce something for our users. So knowing where it's not working for them, that's really, really important. And if you only ever get positive feedback, you won't know what to change and you're probably not asking the right questions.
Mhm.
And it's not realistic to ever have a perfect product. And we know, law of diminishing returns and so forth. So for me, really, the key shift is reframing negative feedback just as information, just as data, and use it as fuel for innovation rather than something for us to avoid or be scared of.
Mhm. And how does that then push innovation?
It pushes innovation by challenging assumptions and helping us to solve the right problems. So, a lot of the work we do in product and service design, and that's also in marketing as well. So, speaking holistically, it's based on assumptions about user needs, right? Especially when you're working in a space for so long, you think you know your product, you think you know your service inside and out, and you probably do, but from a certain perspective. And so negative feedback forces us to question these assumptions and find better solutions for, and this is crucial, what matters the most, because we can think this is really important, but something entirely different could be the main pain point in your service for your users. And it's really common. We are humans. We operate with confirmation bias. No matter how great you are or how critical an eye you have, it's easy to be led towards that confirmation bias. And so, with those assumptions, it's really important that we test them, we challenge them against user experiences rather than relying on what we think we know. And it's something that we do in TSO a lot, Lisa, and you'll be very familiar with, which is we get teams into a space when we're coming up with, we think this is a solution, we'll have challenger workshops. It's challenge me, tell me where I maybe have blind spots as well. And that's what user feedback is. It tells us where our blind spots are. And so feedback that contradicts what you thought you knew, it's not threatening, or it shouldn't be seen as a threat. It's really an opportunity for us to refine our thinking and make better decisions. And I think you see this in the fact that the most successful organizations seek out negative feedback. So companies that really embrace feedback as a part of their culture, they iterate faster and they stay ahead of the competition. And again, it's really tempting to want all of your feedback to look good, but by really encouraging your users to be candid rather than trying to filter feedback, it really creates that continuous loop of improvement and innovation. So when you get negative feedback, instead of being like, oh goodness, how do we reframe this? Just ask like simple questions. What is this telling us? What assumptions does it challenge? And what action can we take to fix it? And ultimately, I believe it builds trust and loyalty. It's integrity for your organization, because how you respond to that negative feedback matters just as much as the feedback itself does. So being open to what we perceive as criticism, and again, it's just information, but by acting on it and communicating those improvements, it shows our users that they're heard, and it also strengthens trust and improves that user experience. And again, if we want to talk in business terms, your profit is directly related to your user experience. So to sum it up, it's not something to fear, this concept of negative feedback. It is literally a direct line to understanding your users and their needs. And that in itself is a really powerful driver of innovation. And so the real risk isn't in the hearing of the negative feedback, it's in the not listening to that feedback that you get.
Really interesting. So what are some of the ways we can gather feedback and find out more about the experience of using services?
Mm-hmm. So I would say the most important thing is user feedback is not one size fits all, and it doesn't happen at one point in the process. It's not just a one time thing, right? So if we want to gather really meaningful user feedback, we need to understand what we want to learn in order to understand how we best gather that information. And this really varies depending on what you're trying to do, or if you're in, the life cycle of an improvement project, for example, the methods you use should adapt depending on where you are in that life cycle and what you need to learn in that life cycle. And so the example, we use the GDS framework very often with our public sector clients, right? And so the research that you want to do at the discovery phase, so where you want to really find out what the problem to be solved is, will include things like interviews, ethnographic studies, stakeholder workshops, and that data analysis to uncover what the struggle really is and why that struggle is occurring. Whereas when you move into the alpha phase, so this is where you actually want to start testing some potential solutions and validate the assumptions around those solutions. You're looking at usability testing, prototyping, A/B testing, and expert reviews to validate what you think you know, again, coming back to that
Mhm.
challenge and assumptions before you move into full development. And that's when you're in the life cycle of a product, right? But even when you've already identified what you need to be solved and you think you've solved it, the principle remains the same for when you're in continuous improvement or when that product or service is live. And so again, it's something you should be doing as a standard practice. It's not something you should just do as a one-off, though. You can do them as one-offs, obviously, when the situation arises. But in terms of understanding user needs, there's really two main ways we gather feedback. So we have direct feedback from users. So this is where we're actively asking users for their input. And then there's also the observed behavior. So indirect feedback, learning from how users interact with our services, whether they explicitly provide that feedback to us or not. And the first one, that direct feedback from users, is what we probably most often think about when we think of user feedback. It's going out to the user and actually engaging with them. And most organizations will rely not solely, but quite heavily on this form of user feedback. And some of those ways we can gather through direct feedback are on-site surveys, so those quick pulse checks on pages or features on the website, exit surveys to capture why users are leaving or to, sense check their experience at the end of a process. You obviously have our CSAT, our customer satisfaction scores, and our net promoter scores to measure that overall satisfaction and that likelihood of recommendation of your product or service. You've user interviews and usability testing for real deep dives into user behaviors and needs. And then you have your feature requests and feedback forms to really let users suggest what improvements they would like to see directly.
And one of those things with surveys in particular is it's really hard to actually get to ask the right question and getting the right measures in place so that that feedback's really useful.
100%, it is an art form. It really is a skill. And I think, and again, not to refer everyone to conversations we've had separately, but we've talked about this, right? It really is a skill. And I think, luckily not in TSO, but it can be in organizations something that's overlooked. It's put out a survey and put some questions down, and not just anyone can do it. Really, framing the right questions is just as crucial as the measures themselves, right? So, without the clear intent, without really understanding what it is that you want to learn, even your most beautifully crafted metrics can really lead us to make misleading conclusions. And so, with direct feedback as well, we also are, especially when it's not controlled direct feedback, so talking about your on site surveys and so forth, we're also relying on users either taking the time to respond or having an impetus to respond. And we know that that means that you're either only going to hear from your most engaged users or your most frustrated users. And that's two ends of the spectrum. And again, that can really skew the information that you're getting back in. And it can really lead us to make reactive decisions, thinking there's a problem where really for the critical 80%, there's not an issue there.
And what about the indirect feedback methods?
So I would say indirect feedback methods maybe aren't always as widely adopted as they usefully could be. So not all users provide direct feedback, and that can be a problem for us because their behavior in itself tells us an awful lot more sometimes than what a user is willing to tell us themselves in that direct feedback. And we call these methods of capturing insights without asking. And I think that this often, certainly in my line of work, often provides some of the most valuable feedback we see. So this can look like analyzing customer services data. So looking at those common support requests and those complaints that reveal the friction points. So that's not coming directly through, from your research. That's not coming directly through from your on-site survey, but you're seeing where users who maybe aren't compelled to write in your survey, this is a problem, but they're coming to customer services saying, I'm stuck here, I need help here. And seeing where those friction points are, it's really, really crucial. And that's also for things like looking at renewals. Why are people maybe not renewing, for example, to really understand where we're not meeting expectations.
Mm.
And it's also a way of really proactively tracking issues so we can address those problems before they become a problem for us and for our users in the whole. Something else I talk about a lot, it's very close to my little service designer heart, which is engaging with your internal business users to uncover those kind of systemic issues that you'll see in your process. So organizations can forget that their business users are users too. So we often focus on the end users, but really your internal processes, your internal systems, your internal products are direct lines into the end user experience that you provide. So asking your internal users where they see friction points, where they see inefficiencies, this will affect the user. And so fixing that for your internal users is just a part of that system view of how to provide that really good experience for our users. And this can be things something we experience where we a few years ago had a manual verification point, and it was still being resolved fairly quickly, but it was just a friction point and people would abandon the journey at that stage in it. And we never found out why until we spoke to our internal business users to identify, actually, this is how we see it. And that was really valuable. You also have something that we work a lot with, Lisa, which is your site analytics. So to see what users do, not just what they say. So looking at that funnel, funnels are so important, where your drop-off points and these abandoned processes really signal those usability barriers. Also looking at search behaviors, how that reveals gaps, what are users looking for but not really finding, and using heat maps and session recordings to really expose where someone's maybe struggling with the content architecture on our site as well. And again, this may not be something someone explicitly reports, but we know this took a user 10 seconds to find this piece of information that should be identifiable in two. Those things are really important. And then we also have your market research as well. So this can often be really separated from your user research and within organizations. But this is really important for us to understand the bigger picture, the system, again, the ecosystem within which our users are operating. So while user insights are really important for us to help refine our existing products and services, market research gives us that broader perspective. It helps us benchmark against industry trends, analyze what our competitors are offering that maybe we're not keeping pace with, and also to identify those emerging user expectations beyond our immediate audience. And this is really important when we talk about innovation, right? Looking at those new opportunities, looking at what we know in our space are really rapidly evolving market demands, and also those shifts in user behavior that internal data itself may not reveal because our users aren't there yet, but our potential user base will want this.
Mm.
So for me, these types of feedback are the types of feedback that I look at probably on a most regular basis, a most, continuous improvement basis. And it's also useful because it often requires less upfront time and cost than, your direct kind of surveys and your lab tests and so forth, which again are so important. But for your continuous improvement as well, these indirect feedback mechanisms are really important for us to be able to extract the right insights to drive those meaningful improvements.
I think that's absolutely right. And we've got a really nice example of where looking at things like site analytics and data that we can see about user behavior can provide useful insight to make those improvements. So TSO is the publisher for the official Driver and Vehicle Standards Agency theory test kit. And this is a mobile app. It's available on Apple and Android. And its purpose is to help people study and practice for their car theory test. It's got more than 770 test questions in there alongside the study material. And because it's the official theory test app from the people that set the tests, we obviously want to make sure it's as helpful as possible to those people that are learning to drive. So one of those pieces of continuous improvement that we looked at was reviewing the app data to see which questions people were struggling with, which questions they were getting wrong most consistently. We identified 10 questions that people were most frequently getting wrong, and then we looked at the potential reasons for that. So these were not simple questions. They usually required learners to actually look across all of the learning materials and all the source materials to be able to answer those questions. But we looked at the wording of the questions in detail to see if they were clear enough. And we looked at the source material to see if it needed more explanation to help people answer those questions. Based on that data, we then looked at rewording those questions and made them clearer wherever we could, and added some further explanation to the study material as well. In addition to that, we also created a blog to highlight the top 3 most difficult questions and emphasise the importance of studying the whole of the material, and provide some study tips as well. So that insight had really helped us to identify what we needed to do. In addition, weighting in the app makes sure that those consistently incorrect answered questions are shown more frequently, to help people to practice those more difficult questions.
Mhm.
And we've obviously continued to track those answer rates. And we've seen up to a 7% increase in correct answers for those most difficult questions, which hopefully translates to more people passing their test.
And
So,
I think that that's so interesting, right? Because a user isn't going to provide feedback on, I got this answer wrong, right? They're going to
exactly.
think it's a them problem.
Mm,
And by looking at that as a user as part of a wider kind of user ecosystem, you're able to actually help the user without getting that kind of direct feedback as well. So I think that's a beautiful
yeah.
example of it. Yeah.
And to make their user experience less frustrating if they
Yes.
if they feel they're getting answers wrong.
Hmm.
So once we've collected data, what do we do with that feedback?
Well, I've spoken loads about collecting the data, but actually that's just the start of the full process. So the real value comes in how we interpret and act on that data, right? And that requires both the right expertise and a really structured approach to ensure that the decisions we're making are informed and they're balanced rather than reactionary. So I would say that extracting insights is a science. So feedback isn't raw truth. It needs to be analyzed correctly in order for us to extract those meaningful insights. And this requires the right knowledge, it requires the right tools, and it requires the right expertise within your organization. And that is your data analysts, your researchers, your service and product designers, your policy experts, your BAs, and so forth to make sure that we're identifying patterns and not just noise. And that can be one of the biggest pitfalls that organizations have is acting on that noise. So when we look at a user saying search is bad, the real issue could be missing content, it could be unclear terminology, or it could even actually be a general site navigation issue rather than an issue with your search function in and of itself. So without the structured analysis of these things, we really run the risk of solving the wrong problem. Then there's the fact that actually knowing what to do with those insights is a balancing act. So if extracting insights is a science, knowing what to do with them is a bit of an art as well. So not all insights should lead to immediate action. So you really need to understand as well the unintended consequences of potentially making a change in one area in order to solve the whole problem. And this is something that is I'm very, very passionate about. So it comes from the QI methodology, but it's looking at what we call balance and measures. And this is used in complex systems. And you and I, Lisa, work with very complex systems. And so the example I always give is when you're looking at hospital discharge rates, for example, you have an improvement project at one end of the whole user journey. And hospitals that can focus on, and there's an example of this that's not coming to me now, but improving discharge rates actually increased readmission rates at the other end of the hospital. So you weren't solving a whole problem. You were relieving pressure on this part of the system and then creating pressure on the other part of the system, which is a
Mm,
problem. But it's
yeah.
also then a problem for user experience, right? And especially in such important systems such as secondary care within healthcare. So for me, it's about looking at short-term improvements and also balancing those with your long-term improvements and really taking that systems perspective is so important. And especially as service designers, looking at that kind of end-to-end journey as well. And a part of that that's really important is you have to know when to disregard feedback to
Mhm.
move from that reactive response to your considered decision making. And that sounds counterintuitive, right? Everyone's opinion matters, and it does, but we don't have to act on every single opinion. So just because we receive it doesn't mean we have to jump all over it. And so, to really make the right decisions, we have to interpret the data very, very carefully. And again, within that systems lens, in order to identify those patterns while recognizing that data can also include outliers, it can include edge cases. And it's not per practice to isolate that outlier, right? That's data interpretation. And those outliers or edge cases may not represent the broader user experience.
Mhm.
They do still provide really valuable insights, but it's maybe in the not just right now box. And how we deal with that at TSO is we have a custom approach to product and service development. And basically, what we've done with that approach is we've added two additional phases that go essentially at the top of that double diamond, which is overlaid with the GDS framework as well. And these two phases are really dedicated to identifying and then crucially prioritizing what we bring through to the design and development process. And a really important part of this is our demand management framework, where insights are constantly collated, they're constantly reviewed, and they're prioritized by, dedicated teams of experts before any action is taken. So before we actually do anything with it, we will evaluate how many users are impacted by this problem. What are the benefits of addressing this versus the effort that it will cost to address it? Does this align with our strategic priorities? And are there any alternative solutions that achieve the same outcome more efficiently? Not everything requires big bang change, right? Sometimes it's a tweak at this end to make this end a lot smoother. And this has really helped us, especially in the last 3 years, to move from a more reactive culture where we feel pressure to act on every single request to a much more considered culture where we really weigh the size of the problem, the potential benefits, and the feasibility before we decide to act on it.
And I guess actually part of that is understanding not only the personas that are using your service, but also the anti-personas that you don't want to
Yes.
take into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yes, lots to consider there. So the theme of Digital Leaders Week this time is AI first.
Mm-hmm.
Are there ways that AI can help with analysing and synthesizing feedback?
Yes. Next one. No. So AI is very rapidly actually becoming a really, really valuable tool for the processing and the interpretation of user feedback. And I speak specifically about the interpretation of user feedback at scale. I think that's a really important thing to bring out here because it really offers us the capabilities to process really large volumes of data much more efficiently and uncover some insights that you could miss. It's very hard or it's challenging to detect manually. And I think when we talk about AI, we talk about it as this homogenous thing, but I think it's really important for us to understand the different types of AI that are out there for us to use because they do specialize in very different aspects of analysis that can be really, really useful in this space of, synthesizing user research. So you have your LLMs, which are large language models, and these can be really used to identify themes and summarize feedback. So again, this is your analysis of large data sets of unstructured feedback to really summarize those key themes. And you can sort customer comments into categories, and that really reduces that manual effort in identifying those common concerns. You have your NLPs, which is natural language processing, and this can really help with sentiment analysis and contextualize and understanding. So this can actually assess sentiment in user comments, and then we can use it to classify comments or feedback as positive, neutral, or negative. And some of the more advanced models can actually detect things like urgency, frustration, and even, and I say this with a little bit of hesitation, intent, which again helps us to prioritize those most urgent issues that we have. Then we have the one that people are probably most familiar with, which is your generative AI. So think your ChatGPTs. And this is really good for synthesizing and structuring feedback for those actionable insights. So your generative AI can actually rephrase, organize, and structure raw user feedback into more digestible reports for decision making. So it's not just giving you back, these are all your positive, negative. It can actually do something with that information. And it can also suggest solutions based on past patterns and offer some data-driven recommendations for that. I say all this and I'm very excited about the advancements in AI, but although it can afford us, faster insights, there are limitations to AI. And I 100% don't think we should be afraid of it, but I do think we should be considered with how we use it. And I think especially in the public sector, and if we look at the AI playbook as well, that's just been released by government, there are things like data privacy, security, and there are ethical considerations, especially around PII as well, that we just need to really take into account, and they have to be really carefully considered and managed, especially in the public sector.
Mm. Are there other limitations or things we need to consider when using AI?
Yes, so I would say that AI doesn't just work out of the box, right? It sounds like this wonderful, magical tool, but actually AI requires, especially when we're talking about your LLMs and so forth, they require large, high quality data sets to really learn patterns and make those accurate predictions that could be very useful to us. And so while it can enhance feedback analysis and automate those insights, training the models, especially in the context of user feedback applications, it does require significant time, it requires significant expertise, and it does require investment as well. Models also, when we look at public sector spaces, they do need domain specific tuning or learning and really to understand that sector specific terminology and the user expectations within that space. So when we talk about sentiment analysis tools, for example, that have been trained on retail customer feedback, those tools may struggle to correctly interpret government service complaints, for example, where users may express frustration differently or, the kind of frustrations they're having look a little bit different. And then I would also say that AI models can degrade over time, right? So they do need fine tuning, they do need upkeep and so forth. And again, these aren't inherent negatives within it necessarily, but it's just not for us to look at it as a magical tool. It's not just a one-time setup. It really is an ongoing investment, and it could be a worthwhile investment, but we need to be very considered about where we actually make that investment as well. We do also have other considerations. So, like the fact that LLMs and NLP models may interpret things like sarcasm, for example, or cultural nuances or ambiguous phrasing a little bit differently, or they may misinterpret it. So, this can lead to inaccurate sentiment analysis. So, if someone wrote, for example, brilliant, another broken feature, this could be put into the, positive column, and that's just not correct. As I've also mentioned, AI models are also trained on existing data sets, which means that they can also, and this is one of my, kind of areas of interest, and I'm a little bit more thoughtful about this area, is where your models can also inherit biases. And that means that they can potentially overlook certain demographics or over prioritize common complaints. And that can be very tricky and that can be very detrimental, especially in the public sector. And when I think back to the healthcare space as well, for example, that's something we need to be very, very conscious of. And so while AI can be very useful, human validation is really essential in tandem with AI to make sure those insights are fair and representative.
Mm.
So for me, what it comes down to, I could talk about this all day, Lisa. But for me, what it comes down to, the kind of core element is understanding that artificial intelligence and emotional intelligence are very different things, though they're both equally important. So while AI can speed us up and make us more efficient, especially for large data sets, blindly relying on AI as the thing, or trying to over innovate with AI far too quickly, as I'll not mention the article, but an article was released last year about using AI for user interface design that sparked a lot of debate, shall we say, diplomatically, in the design community. These are things that we have to be cautious of, right? Because it can lead us to flawed decision making. So human interpretation is still needed, and each type of AI has major strengths in analyzing and synthesizing user feedback, but I do feel that none can fully replace human judgment. So this fear that we're seeing a lot more in the media and so forth of AI as a replacement for people, it's really crucial that we don't think of it that way. It's more a really important support to help us do our work more efficiently if it's used in the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, however we've gathered that user feedback, how
Mhm.
should organisations act on it?
Mm. So, like I said earlier, collecting the user feedback is just the start in the process. It's only really valuable if it leads to meaningful action. So, like I said earlier, you really need a structured, measurable approach to ensure that the feedback isn't just gathered, but interpreted, prioritized, and acted upon as well, right? Because it can go into a little bit of a black box. So the first thing is understand the feedback before you make any action. I've spoken quite a lot about this, but not all feedback is equal. So organizations really need to assess what is most critical for them to bring forward to the discovery phase, or if it's a much smaller project, they bring forward to implementation. And having frameworks in place, like our demand management framework, using tools like impact, effort matrices, the Pareto principle, I think is always a really useful tool to help us really understand what will most effectively and efficiently, which is key as well, drive those meaningful outcomes. This also, and again, this is something I'm very passionate about, is we need to understand the actual problem to be solved. And so this is where the discovery phase of the GDS methodology, for example, is really crucial. You get that feedback in, you say, okay, 80% of our users have cited a problem with search, for example. We need to bring this forward. This is an issue. And you start with that. You start with what you think needs to be solved. But then that discovery phase is about really drilling down into what actually needs to be solved. And quite often those things look very different, right? So using the test or the search example that we had as well, we had a client where search was coming back in our user feedback as, testing very poorly. And it was very tempting for us to dive in and say, okay, let's look at the data that sits behind. Let's look at our data models. Let's look at the technology we're using for search. But we took a bit of a pause and we really drilled down. We really did our due diligence. And it actually turned out the issue with search, which we took to mean search feature, was actually a very easily correctable IA problem. So the information architecture, it was navigation that users were finding very difficult on the site. And that doesn't mean we threw out search. Search absolutely did need some improvements, but it wasn't the fire we thought it was. And it meant we could make those information architecture improvements, which we could do via the CMS, so it didn't require development effort. We could implement those fairly quickly for a much higher return on user experience in a smaller time frame, whilst also then working on that wider piece and to give ourselves the space and time to solve that, bigger problem as well. So that phase of really looking at what the problem actually is really critical for me.
Mm,
The other piece is tell the story. So one of the biggest blockers to innovation and the work that we are seeking to do can be leadership, not understanding the why behind what we're trying to do. And at the end of the day, that's their job is business viability, right? What is going to provide the best returns. And so data alone is never going to secure you buy-in. You really need the right information. You need a compelling narrative that really connects those user pain points to the business impact. Show how inefficiencies drive cost, reduce engagement, or create frustration, and use those real user stories alongside your metrics to make the issue felt, not just heard, right? And decision makers really respond to risk and opportunity. So frame your improvements as a way to prevent losses, to boost efficiency, or to unlock growth. And again, it's telling the story with the feedback that you have. And then one of the key things is acting on feedback isn't enough, right? So we've collected it, we've gotten buy-in, we're acting on it. That's not enough in and of itself. You really need to have your metrics understood and tracked to see where your changes actually improve user experience. And this also needs to be done continuously. It's not just a one-time thing. This has to be throughout your life cycle. And this brings us back to what we spoke about at the start, right? When you're in the discovery phase, your user feedback is different from when you're in the alpha phase. And you have to be really clear on the intent and what you're seeking to learn in order to really drive success, but also then measure that success. And again, it's those balancing measures as well, right? It's considering that you don't create a ripple effect by an improvement in one area. It's that system view. And the final thing that I think we can miss quite often, but in the public sector, we're getting much better at this, but it's closing that feedback loop. So one of the biggest frustrations for users is providing feedback and seeing nothing happen. So even if your feedback isn't acted on immediately, acknowledge this feedback, explain what's being done or why it's not being done right now, and also showcase improvements based on user input. So this can be release notes, this can be blog posts, this can be direct updates. And government digital services, for example, often publish their roadmaps and their change logs to really demonstrate transparency and how user feedback is used. And again, our users are the most important thing. They're why we do what we do. So really engaging with them and showing your feedback actually is valuable, we're not just saying this, is really, really important as well.
That's really important, you're right. And I think we've got another nice example here of where we've managed to close that feedback loop by surveying users both before and after improvements. And that really helps you to identify where those improvements need to be made, but also to gauge reaction to those changes.
Mhm.
So TSO obviously publishes regulation for regulators, and often that regulation is updated several times a year. For one particular website, when we surveyed our users, they reported some frustrations with understanding what has changed each time the website was updated, and they had no easy way of tracking those changes or revisions.
Mhm.
So after some further discovery, we introduced a content revision timeline, which is a visual tool showing where information was updated and when information was updated. This means that users can easily switch between versions of the content and see exactly what has changed. So after that implementation, we went back and surveyed users again and found that 71% of users agreed or strongly agreed that the online user experience had improved. And we had a 94% neutral or positive satisfaction with the service. So we also asked for some narrative feedback, and people were commenting specifically on that piece of functionality, saying it's really clear now to see when things were revised and what those revisions were. So satisfaction surveys are a really useful way, aren't they, of
Yeah.
identifying specific improvements that need to be made, but also, as you said, Dan, closing that loop and
Mhm.
actioning that feedback is critical to that customer satisfaction.
Absolutely.
So, we're going to wrap up now, but I'll ask you, Dan, what would your top tips be for collecting and acting on user feedback to make improvements?
So my top tips would be gather feedback from multiple sources. So back to what we are talking about at the start, direct user feedback, that direct user input, your surveys, your interviews, alongside your behavioral insights. So your analytics, your customer support, and your internal teams as well, to really build that full picture. The core principle of GDS and what we do is solving a whole problem. So you need the full picture to solve that whole problem. Um, Extract meaningful insights, not just data. So challenge your assumptions, identify your patterns, and consider those unintended consequences before you act. Don't be reactive, be considerate and reflective, and really strategic about what you want to do. Prioritize strategically, but then iterate, right? So use your frameworks like your effort impact matrix, your Pareto principle to really focus on the small percentage of issues causing the biggest problems. And also, crucially, keep learning. Feedback happens throughout the process. It is not just a one time thing. And that would probably be one of my biggest takeaways, which is it is not just a one time thing. Keep doing it and keep iterating it and keep trying to evolve it to do it better. Tell a compelling story to drive buy-in. Again, I think this is one of the things we don't think about quite as often, but it's really, really crucial to actually get those improvements in front of your users. So use data, use user stories to really connect the feedback to those business outcomes to overcome any kind of resistance and really foster that culture of continuous improvement within your organization. And then measure and track your improvements. So define your clear metrics, your task completion, your conversion rates, your CSAT, and so forth to make sure that the changes that you're making have a real impact. And what I would say as well, given the topic of what we're talking about as well, is don't be worried if even after all of that, your change doesn't, enact the outcome that you actually wanted. Like we said at the start, negative feedback is absolutely not failure, it's information. So one of my favorite quotes from Samuel Beckett that I'll leave everyone with is try again, feel better.
Brilliant. Thanks, Den. That's been really insightful. Great conversation. You can find both of us on LinkedIn
Mhm.
if you'd like to know any more, or take a look at the TSO website at tso.co.uk. We'll end now, and hope you've enjoyed that Digital Leaders Week, and we look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thank you.